Well, good morning. It's the 2nd of January 2026, and welcome to Surviving at 70. And I'm Michael, possibly the worst YouTuber or attempted YouTuber on earth. I last posted on the 26th of June, I believe. Round about that time, stuff was happening very, very close to me within the family, etc. And I got an angry head on, and all sorts of things started to take over my life, made it quite awkward to do all sorts of things, and distracted me. Anyway, uh, why am I posting this today? Well, this is not what I spent a year or a year and a half thinking about putting onto Surviving at 70 when I was planning on starting to have a go at this malarkey. This is a reaction to all sorts of things, and it's not just for 70-year-olds. When you watch it, when you listen to it, whether you agree with me or not, whether you think that I'm being a bit of a worry merchant, well, that's for your opinion. But please share it. Others might disagree. This type of video has been done for several years in the United States, and it's usually by someone doing a video advertisement because they're going to turn around and say, oh, and to survive this, whatever they predicted was going to happen, we will sell you a pallet load of food, which will last you for 3 or 4, 5 years down in your basement. And, for $5,000 or whatever it is, we'll deliver it to your house and you won't starve when the apocalypse comes. Well, this is completely different. I just want to make people think. And we all plan for things at work, perhaps. We do regular fire drills. We do maybe regular updates on first aid training, etc., etc., etc. How many of you ever think, what would I do? What would my family do? What would my loved ones do if suddenly there was no such thing as electricity? Now, you can laugh, you can think, oh, here we are, another old loony, but bear with me for a second or two, because on the 28th of April last year, there was an event in Iberia, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal, and actually a little bit of the south of France. The rest of France managed to hold up because of the resilience of their grid. But the whole of Spain and Portugal's electricity system just failed, and it was an absolute catastrophe. There's a think tank, a group called the EIS Council, who have been going around since 2009. And they reported on this to say that this was a wake-up call for the world. And it was a case of not if, but when this would happen again. And I would suggest, and I'm strongly suggesting, that you have a listen, because I think that the United Kingdom, Britain, is an absolute it's worrying that it could happen to our grid. Most of you will be aware that at least once, perhaps every winter, in the United Kingdom, we have come down across the whole of our islands something called an anticyclone. It's where there's virtually no wind. The wind can't move the moisture. It's a pretty high sort of pressure system. I'm no meteorologist, But basically, it becomes very, very gloomy. We never see the sun. It's usually a winter event, so the hours of sun are quite limited anyway, but we can't see it through the fog or the cloud or whatever it is, and it becomes quite horrible. Now, for years, that just brought on a little bit of glumness. People got a bit fed up because you do when you don't see the sun, etc., etc. But in those days, the vast majority of our electricity came from coal. And the fact that there was no wind and virtually no sun didn't affect what came out the plugs in the wall. The coal was still going into the generators. And at the end of the day, the electricity came out of the wall, and we could all do what we had to do to keep ourselves warm and etc. etc. Anyway, as I say, 28th of April last year, the whole of Spain and Portugal went without power, and it was chaos, in spite of the fact that the 28th of April was what's described as a Goldilocks day. It wasn't too hot, it wasn't too cold. It was quite a nice day. Temperatures were very, for us humans, a very livable sort of temperature. But neither, regardless of that, about 15 people died. One person who was on some sort of life support machine at home, their generator failed to kick in. Another person who had a generator, it kicked in, but it had been very badly installed. And in fact, they and their entire family were killed by carbon monoxide poisoning from the generator's exhaust. So there we are, Goldilocks, and people were still dying. It took them a little while to get things up and running again. But why should we be bothered in the United Kingdom? Well, I'm certainly no electrical engineer. I really do not understand anything very much about the transmission or how the electric grid works throughout the United Kingdom. But there are plenty of people out there who do, and I'm not including politicians in this. I'm talking about long-term engineers who understand exactly what it takes to get 240 volt alternating current into our homes. Now, the fact that it's 240 volt alternating current is actually quite an important factor, because none of the renewables, which people like Ed Miliband are passionately, religiously, absolutely nailed to, they all produce direct current, which is completely different. You go back to the 1890s, 1880s, United States, where electricity was first being introduced to cities. You had got two competing systems. You'd got Tesla with their alternating current, and you'd got Edison with his direct current, and they were fighting it out for who was going to make the big bucks by getting into people's businesses and homes and start to charge them so much a month for their electricity. And not unlike an awful lot of business these days, there are all sorts of dirty tricks to one person managed to electrocute a whole load of farm animals with the opponent's electricity stream to show how dangerous it was. Another one managed to persuade the state that they should use the other person's electricity to start executing murderers by their kind of electricity in the electric chair, showing just how dangerous it must be if they were using it to kill people. Anyway, I slightly digress. As I say, this think tank, the EIS Council, who are an international body and seem to know what they're talking about, are saying it should be a wake up call, and it's not an if, but a when will this happen again. And most of that is down to there's a very well established engineering term, which is Swiss cheese engineering. They talk about slices of Swiss cheese, which, as we all know, have quite large holes in them. And most times, when an aeroplane crashes or a ship sinks or any other fairly major disaster occurs, it's not because one thing has failed, it's because four or five things usually fail at exactly the same time. And they all align to turn something that should be reported on to, learn from in the future. They all line up and they cause a major catastrophe. Now, unfortunately, for whatever reason, and I really don't want this to become political because the electric grid in this country has been failing, going really badly downhill through all sorts of governments for about 40 or 50 years. It really is not what it was. And the fact that the current man in charge is just not open to any reasonable discussion from engineers and people who know what they're talking about is just making the wake up call even worse because, as I say, we all plan at work for fire risks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But nobody is planning for what would happen if four or five holes in a piece of Swiss cheese rather, aligned and cause a breakdown in the electricity grid. Now, sadly, there is virtually nothing that you or I, ordinary people, can do to improve the national grid. And certainly the last thing that is going to improve it would be going out and ordering solar panels for your roof, because there are engineers out there who know what they're talking about, who are saying that to put anything more than, say, 20% renewables onto a national grid network is suicidal because you start getting beyond 20% of the input, and all you need is one large cloud going over a farm of solar panels coinciding with a sudden wind drop somewhere else and perhaps a little bit of a glitch in a gas-fired power station. And all of a sudden, all sorts of things start triggering each other. And once the triggering starts, I mentioned earlier that renewable sources develop direct current. Now, we work, the stuff that comes out of our walls, it's alternating current. So that means that every second, the direction of feed goes 50 times up and down, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Now, to turn direct current into alternating current and put it out onto the grid, taking it from sort of 12 volts up to the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of volts that whiz through the pylons that you see going across the country. It requires electronics of a really quite extraordinary level. We basically, I say we, those in charge of the country, have, by going all in for renewables, have designed this massive disconnect between direct current and alternating current. And the only way to alter that is to come up with very, very large boxes of very, very complicated electronics. Um, you've probably seen car chargers being installed near you, possibly in your supermarket car park or what have you recently. And you'll notice that wherever those chargers are being installed, there's a big box or several big boxes being installed quite close by. And what that's basically doing is changing what comes off of the national grid to make it usable to feed into the cars and what cars will typically accept as a charging input to their batteries. Anyway, as I say, short of a huge change at a general election, which in itself isn't going to immediately solve the problems, because if we started to, say, burn gas and coal again, or wanted to tomorrow, turbines to generate the power are currently on about a 7 or 8 year waiting list. You just can't pop into your local store and buy one. They have to be made, and lots of countries around the world have already got orders in from the people who can make them. So we would be tagging on behind. So there is no immediate fix to the stability of the electricity grid on the United Kingdom. So what can we do to survive this loss? Well, don't think, well, I'm all right, Jack, because I've got a gas boiler, I've got a gas hob in the kitchen, etc., because, and you try and correct me on this if you like, but when I was a kiddie, the whole country used to have things called gasometers, absolutely huge things. I know we had one right down by the river mouth here in Spittal, the end of the River Tweed. And I remember several when I used to come out of King's Cross on a train. There used to be several to the left of to the west of the track coming out of King's Cross, feeding London. Well, we don't have that now. There are very, very few left, if any. So I believe that the gas is pumped into our gas systems. And of course, our boilers, etc., are all controlled with electronic controls. And I think the gas grid is probably controlled by computers, etc., which they might have backup generators, which would keep them passively going for a wee while. I don't know. We would hope that maybe hospitals, etc., if their generators have had any maintenance done on them, or if they've just been skipped to save money, maybe they won't start. Who knows? But what can we do ourselves in order to try and survive several days without electricity? And I say several days because I don't think that once all of these things and systems have tripped out, I don't believe for 1 minute that it will be possible to get things up and running at 5 minutes notice. I don't know what kind of planning has gone into this. I don't know whether the people who press the buttons and twiddle the knobs at the national grid have trained for this sort of thing. I'd love for some comments in the bottom from people who say, "Oh, you're being, we'd know exactly what we'd do." Would you? Anyway, what could we do? Well, I think it comes down to we need to start forming communities again. How many of us actually know our neighbours? How many of us know how old our neighbours are, how they heat their houses, what kind of situation they're in. Um, Once upon a time, when there was a localized electricity failure or what have you, or flooding or et cetera, people would go to their usually local pubs who would often be equipped. They would have maybe a few letting bedrooms, so any elderly or maybe pregnant or nursing mothers or what have you would have, and they'd often have a really lovely coal or log fire going in the bars, etc., and people could get round. And however, these days, how many pubs are left? And how many pubs would be able to open? How many of them have got completely electronic or digital, etc.? So there we are. We're all vulnerable. There are vulnerable groups. The elderly, the infirm, the disabled, pregnant women, new mothers, youngsters, etc. To be honest, we are all vulnerable. So I would implore you all to think about what I'm saying and start thinking, wow, do you know what? Maybe, just maybe, we really ought to start that many years ago, people formed neighborhood watch groups. Perhaps you've still got neighborhood watch that you could start to build this on. But, um, you know, failing to plan is planning to fail. And perhaps if an anticyclone went on for a wee while and nobody knew that one of us was there and we were in a totally cold house and unable to heat any food, etc., um, planning to not be alive at the end of it is an unfortunate way of looking at it. So there we are. I mean, there's all sorts of things that we could go into about the national grid and why there are being, we talk about 240 volts, which is sort of the speed that the water comes out of your garden hose at. Yeah. There are parameters, maximum and minimum, that our household equipment can cope with. It's kind of between 230 and 253 that the national grid can cope with, depending on, if we suddenly get a massive burst of sun throwing electricity into the grid, and or vice versa, massive cloud suddenly shutting it down. But there's already talk about taking the mean average, that what we would normally get, which is 240, down to 235, which means instead of a 10-volt buffer at the bottom, we've only going to have a sort of 5-volt buffer at the bottom. I'd liken it to perhaps hospitals in the 70s and 60s. In the summer, everything going well, the nurses would have maybe half the beds full, and they'd be able to give absolutely fabulous care. And then suddenly, we'd have an influenza outbreak or maybe a bus crash if you live near a major road. And suddenly there's an influx of 30, 40, 50 people needing beds. And the beds were there. And suddenly the hospital was full and it was buzzing. But it was able to cope because it had spare capacity. Then suddenly in the 1980s, it was thought that hospitals should run the same way as hotels, with 100% occupancy every night, leading to all sorts of horrible stories, which I might go on to at another time, with people being discharged from the beds 2 o'clock in the morning to make room for more needy people. But there we are. I would strongly suggest, and I think this is going to be an awful lot easier for people who live in rural areas rather than cities, because rural areas, there might still be a lot more people who have got log fires, coal fires, multi-fuel stoves, etc., who could be the host home for, a local group. Call it what you will. As I say, once upon a time, we would call them neighborhood watch groups. Call these what you will. But yeah, think about it. I have started making sure that our family cars permanently have their fuel tanks running from between 3/4 and full, because who knows, it might turn out that sitting with it idle would be the only place that you can keep yourself warm. If your only car is an EV, then I don't know what to suggest for you. But also, you might want to travel to a relative or what have you that you're worried might be in the cold, perhaps to bring them back to you if you've got some way of keeping warm. But if we lose electricity, you will lose the ability, I would suggest, to pump fuel at a fuel station. The old days where there were handles on the side of petrol pumps have long since gone. They're all electric. All of the payment systems are electric and electronic. So, think about it. If you've got a full tank of fuel, then you've got options, you've got possibilities. Just a couple of weeks ago, a member of my family went off to hospital. Our local A&E is over 60 miles away, and he was in for a couple of nights, and we clocked up 260 miles or so because of following the ambulance down, finding out what was wrong with him, and then going down and picking him up and bringing him home. We would have been struggling to do that if we couldn't get fuel and if we hadn't already got fuel in the car. So there we are. Forewarned is forearmed. I think I've made the point. I'm just starting to repeat myself now. Signing out, surviving at 70. And this one's for all of you, whatever age. Think about it. How would you survive 3, 4, 5, 6 days without electricity? What kind of food should you have in store? If your refrigerator's not working, etc., etc., etc. Anyway, if you've got to this point, and I hope you certainly have, I make this video hoping that it won't happen, hoping that we don't have an anticyclone, hoping that when it does occur, it's at a point where we're, for whatever reason, not using a great deal of electricity and the grid survives. But if it doesn't, try and do some planning. Think, what would you do? If your car breaks down, you've probably got RAC membership or what have you, but maybe that's something. We're all a bit short of money these days. Maybe you've let your RAC membership drop or your AA membership drop to save a few quid. Maybe you've skipped a service on your car, skipped a service on your boiler to save a few quid. So what would you do if you were suddenly stranded by the side of a motorway and you're a few miles away from home? Failing to plan, planning to fail. Anyway, for me, Michael, at Surviving at 70, please like, subscribe, and share as widely as you possibly can, and start getting people to think, how would we survive without electricity for a few days? Thank you.